Let's talk about how to make our R2 domes shiny. Let's get to it. Hey guys, welcome back to Cause 3D, and as you can see, you guessed it, I am working on an R2 unit right now. This is my third one that I'm building, and it's one of those builds that when you get into the dome especially, a lot of guys I see on different forums and different places, and even I get asked when they see my R2 unit, they say, how do you get the dome so shiny? They've started the process, they're sanding stuff down, they're not getting the print lines out of it and so forth. So I thought that I would just go over quickly what it takes to get this dome to be shiny and look like spun aluminum. So let's get to it. All right, so this is a pretty simple process that we go through. It's simple, but it's time consuming, and you have to have a pretty good eye for detail. So let me explain first where we are in this process. None of the panels, not a single panel in this is currently glued in. Some of them are taped in just to be held as I'm working on this and spraying it and being able to see it as a whole. Make sure everything fits before you get too far into the process. So when you get these parts off as a raw print, I have already glued them all together, obviously, and I immediately follow it up once it's glued together with an 80 grit random orbit sander. You have to be very careful with the 80 grit. You can't be staying in the same spot too long. It will melt the plastic. You can't bear down on it. You just let the 80 grit go through, and what you're looking at, the best way to describe it is you're just scratching the surface. You're not sanding anything. You're just getting in there and scratching off any high spots. And once I hit it with the 80 grit, I follow it up with a 220 on the random orbit sander again. And then a lot of times we'll go back and resand it with usually around a 300 grit, give or take, 250, 300, 320, somewhere in there. But just hand sand it off to get any plastic, balled up, melted plastic that's left on it. You want that removed. Once I do that, I go in, and I've got a part here that I have just done today. I use the Bondo glazing and spot putty. I mix it in a bowl with some acetone to thin it down, and then I use a crappy chip brush or a crappy paint brush to carefully brush it on. And the first coat, when you brush it on, if it's too thin, it's not going to look, you're not going to get good coverage of it. That's okay. It dries in minutes with the acetone. Go back, do a second coat. I typically stay out of areas that are recessed, and all this I'm going to have to come back in and do differently. But you don't want it globbing all over. As a great example, if you can see it on camera, and none of my panels fall out here, but around that top dome, there is a super light coat that's actually that I got in here. It's not about getting it super thick the first time, it's just slowly building it up. As you're building it up, you can go back, you can sand it. I usually use anywhere from a 300 to 400 grit just to knock down any paintbrush strokes that are left when you're doing this process. I mean, if it's a flat surface, I use a random orbit sander. Again, go very lightly, slow speed. But back on the dome, hopefully by the time you actually get to the glazing part, you've gotten most of your print lines sanded out with the 80 grit, and the 220 grit is what I've been using. So this I have already sanded, I've glazed it, and then I went back, and after I got done glazing it and sanding it again, I touched up any spots that I could see that I knew were going to be problem spots, seams that might show through, and so forth. And then I sanded again, and then I started using primer. Now the primer that I use is the Upol Expert Sandable Primer, double coat. I love this stuff, very thick. I've got probably 3 coats on this currently. I do spray it in gray, so we'll get to the black here in a second. But again, I am going over it. Any spots that I see, I might sand a little bit in different trouble spots. Go back and add some Bondo glazing if I need to. Sand again. Put another coat of the Upol primer on there. And then when I am happy using different lighting in the shop, I will actually look at different angles of this to see if I notice any seams that are still left or overhangs that I have where the seams are together, anything like that. And once I get it pretty well to the point that I think it's almost time to start sanding on it, I do a black base coat. Now it's flat black. The reason I do the black base coat is actually very simple. And that's what I'm going to show you today. I am going to go back with a 400 grit or even a 500 grit. I haven't decided what I'm going to use today. And I'm going to wet sand this whole thing. Now the goal is to wet sand off all the flat black. And the reason for that is because I have a spot right here, which is one of the seam lines, that if you get it just perfectly in the right light, you can actually see from about here to here, there's still a seam there. The reason I'm going back to do this is because when I start wet sanding this black, this flat black away and getting rid of it, I'm going to be able to see if I have a super low spot there, because my sandpaper is not going to get into the low spot of the black. So then I can focus my attentions a little better on if I have any pits or holes or anything that's a flaw up to this point. So I'm going to grab my sandpaper, I'm going to grab a bucket of water and just continually dip my sandpaper in the water and sand it. I'm going to put something down to catch any of the stuff because it does make a mess, anything that comes off of this, so that my work area can stay clean quickly. But I'm going to demonstrate that process right now. So as we go, if I do notice any problem spots, I'll make sure to get a zoom in on this so that you can see what's going on, where a problem spot might be, and how we're going to fix it. So I'm going to get to it. All right, guys, so I've got all of the panels actually sanded, but something interesting happened that I don't think has ever happened during one of my builds. As I was wet sanding all of the dome pieces and the panels on the sides, I realized that I had gotten them so smooth in the pre-part that I did not need to sand off all the black. I mean, those are the smoothest panels I think I've ever had on a build. Just one of those weird things, when you put the time in at the beginning, you don't have to worry about it later on in the build. So now there were a couple trouble spots here, because I do mention that sanding all the black off is important. And in this case, I didn't have to do it. I for the most part, had no pinholes. I had no wavy parts to it, no print lines whatsoever. So I did have to work on these two pieces quite a bit. So this is what I'm talking about. One coat of your black primer, sand it off, and you're going to be able to find out some of your trouble spots. Now, there is still some black on this, and I'm okay with it. This piece in particular is a very difficult piece to sand. I'm good with it. On the build, it will show, it won't show any print lines or anything like that. So I did want to explain probably the first build that I've, maybe not the first, but one of the first builds I've ever had that I sanded all these. I did not have to take it back down to primer. So one of those things that you find out speeds up the process. I'm happy. So I'm going to start on the dome now, and we're going to start wet sanding that and seeing where that takes us. I'm hoping that it's going to be the same way as the panels. I know I've got a couple trouble spots that I'm going to have to go a little deeper on, but here we go. Let's get started and see what our problems are. All right, so there you go. Now that I have sanded down the dome, all the black, flat black that I had sprayed on, sanded off. And the important part is you can see where we're getting back to the Bondo glazing right here because there was just a big trouble spot there. There was another one here where there was a seam, and there was another spot somewhere along here. But anyway, multiple spots are taken care of now that we've wet sanded. And the reason for wet sanding is you have more control. You've got a lubrication of the water when you're sanding. As you're sanding, you can wipe it away, see how deep you're actually getting into the black, into the original base gray that you've sprayed on there. And hopefully we've gotten all of the print lines smoothed out, as well as the seam lines, which are the most important. So next step, we are going to flat black everything, and I'll film that as well. And then it's going to get a gloss coat, and then we move on to the silver spray paint before we start the rub and buff. So we'll get to that next. So here's where we are at this point. Everything has had a flat black after sanding coat, sanded back so that it's smooth, wet sanded, and now it has a clear coat on every piece. Now the reason that these blue pieces are black is because we want a black gloss surface to apply our silver onto, and then we will apply the blue. And what that does is it makes the blue a more true color of blue, rather than if you spray it onto a white surface, it's going to come out a lot brighter typically. If you spray it on a black surface, it's going to come out a very dark blue, take multiple coats. So we start with a silver base for the blue panels. Now, my normal go-to is the Rust-Oleum Metallic, but I don't know if they've changed their formula lately or what, but I'm just not as happy as I was with it like a year or 2 years ago. So I'm going to forego that this time, and I actually am going to try the Dupli-Color brand of the Silver Metallic. Now I will say this is expensive. I think I just paid $17 for this can. This can should, in theory, coat all the silver parts that I need. Plus, it should also be able to coat the dome, the blue parts, and everything else. Now, on the dome, I had something very interesting, and I don't know if I'm going to include the footage in it or not, but I used my paint gun to apply the clear coat, and my paint gun was either clogged or something was going on with it the other day. I don't know if I didn't have my pressure set too high, too low, what was going on. I need to look into that. But I ended up using a rattle can because the paint gun was just, it was overspraying, and it was doing a weird thing on this dome. So I actually had to wet sand everything back down and apply a second coat with a rattle can. And I'm not as happy with the coat, but it's not bad, and I still have some spots that I want to make sure look perfect before I start adding the silver to it. So the silver, when we put the silver on everything, then we move to the next step of actual rub and buff of this. And I always inspect the dome that I'm getting ready to paint and make sure that there are literally no blemishes, no scratches, no pockmarks in it. I mean, it has to be almost perfect for the rub and buff to have its intended effect. So next we're going to hit this with silver, and let's get to the paint booth and see how that works out for us, and then we'll go from there. I'm very happy with this silver metallic Dupli-Color, actually. It's a little less metal flaky than the Rust-Oleum metallic. Now the Rust-Oleum metallic's a lot cheaper, so that you have to factor that in as well. But I'm actually very impressed with the Dupli-Color, and I have painted the dome now and all the parts. These are all ready to have the blue, Sonic Blue Pearl Dupli-Color put on it. Now, there are a couple panels that, one of the panels, I believe it's that one, does stay silver. I am going to make sure that I do a second coat on that one to keep it nice and silver, because there's a little tiny bit of black still showing through on a couple of these, which doesn't matter on when you put the blue on, because it does have a nice even coat on it. The interior, if I'm not mistaken, I'm going off of memory here. I'm trying to see my other R2 over in the corner, but I believe this interior here is still silver, so that's going to have to dry. I'm going to let that dry 24 to 48 hours, and then I'll mask it off with some tape and then paint the blue border around it. This piece as well, I believe that piece is silver on the interior. Again, I have to go back and look at a couple of these. It's been several years since I've painted an R2. Now the interior of the top, I believe, is silver as well, and I usually go ahead and cut a piece of masking material to put in there, and then have to sometimes go back with a brush and touch that up if it has any bleed over. But so far I'm really impressed with this particular paint as far as silvers go for a base coat. Now let's look at the dome. Oh, and the holo projectors, I mean, they'll get a coat of rub and buff as well, but I'll tell you, it looks like paint still. I won't deny that, and it probably doesn't translate well on camera. I mean, it looks shiny, especially under these lights and stuff. But overall, I am very impressed with the way they've turned out. Let me grab the dome. Now the dome, because it's a larger surface, I mean, you could stop here. I'm happy with this silver. It looks good, but I want to move to the next step and actually hit it with the rub and buff as well. And I know a lot of guys will do a black gloss coat first, then hit it with rub and buff. I've found that if you put the silver over the top, in my experience, it does hide a lot of imperfections when you're rubbing the rub and buff in, and you don't get nearly as many splotches on it. So we'll let this cure really well, and then we'll move on to the rub and buff step and the bluing of the parts. So hang with me. I'm very happy with the silver paint that I have used, but I'm going to take it one step further, because this is very smooth, but it still, in my opinion, looks like paint. So I am now going to wet sand the silver paint that I put on there with 1000 grit, making sure that I get it as smooth as possible, and then I'm going to follow it up with a coat of the mirror chrome from Spastics. Now this is one of my favorite paints. It is quite bright, and we're gonna see what that does. As I said, at this point, I would probably say you could clear coat this, and it's gonna look good. I mean, obviously, it's shiny enough, and a clear coat's gonna even bring out more depth, give it more depth, and bring out more shine to it. But I'm gonna take it a step further and hit it with the mirror chrome, because I've never done an R2 dome with mirror chrome, so it's time to start wet sanding. All right, we got the dome wet sanded and it looks pretty good, very smooth. And I am now going to clean it. I'm just going to use some window cleaner. Make sure we get out any imperfections that are left over after we did the sanding. I've already wiped it down with some water. Now I'm going to go back and make sure that we are good and clean. So let's get all that off there, all that residue. Then the next thing we're going to come back with, you can see it's still pretty dirty. So we want to get all that off as best we can. The next thing we're going to do is come back in and we're going to clear coat this one more time because the Spastics works a lot better on a clear coated surface. So once we get this all wiped down nice and clean, I'm going to follow it up with the clear coat. And my personal preference is the Montana varnish. I have a really good experience with this stuff. It's just a gloss varnish. And varnish usually does not affect your paint in a negative way. It can, so you may want to do a test spray on this. But I have found that the varnish, for the most part, usually great results with it. So we're going to get this all wiped down, move over, give it a good wet coat of varnish, and then we are going to move over and do this final spray with the Spastics. All right, so there you have it. This is the Spastics painted dome, and this is my old Rub and Buff dome. And as you can see, they're both really shiny. I don't dispute that, but it's hard to tell on camera, I'm sure. This one is a much more uniform color. The Rub and Buff dome has a lot of imperfections in it, which that doesn't bother me, especially if you look at it close up. You can see that there are some imperfections in this dome where I applied the Rub and Buff, and I'm okay with that because R2 is not perfect. But this dome came out really well. I am going to toy with maybe polishing this dome at some point just to see what happens on it, and maybe get a better gloss buildup with some wax on there perhaps. I don't know yet. I'm going to do some test pieces first. But the main part of this is it's all about your prep work. You have to get your print lines out first. You have to make sure that you have it nice and sanded smooth. Any imperfection is going to show through. And up here where the pie halves come, this was not a full printed dome. This was a pied section dome. You can see where the lines are up here now. You can't really see them in the print because I made sure to get those out. But it magnifies any imperfections that you have, so you really have to take time and care on your prep work. That is the most important thing of this whole build process. So, well, appreciate you joining me. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you learned something from it. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe. We'd love to hear a comment if you want to drop one down below, and we'll see you in the next video.